Triumph in the Face of Adversity by Lisa Kelly. Wounded to warrior. My most traumatic event to date would probably be when I was hours from death, following a couple of years of abusing alcohol in my early 20s. I was overcoming an alcohol addiction when I began to reflect on my life and what got me to that point. It was then that I realised that, in fact, my whole life had seemed traumatic. As part of my journey, I have put my reflection into words and I have been called to share them. I hope that my story brings you hope and inspiration. And should you resonate with any of the parts, please talk to someone you can trust, such as your local support services or a friend. Let me know if I can help you on your own journey in any way at all. My story starts at the beginning, all about family and childhood. With what seemed a small situation at the time, but the small situations have turned into big triggers throughout my life, I'll start with some of those triggers through my story. My parents came from big families. They ran businesses and were sociable. I was always surrounded by people. I spent a lot of time with family and childminders as my parents worked or socialised. Being an only child, I became very close to my friends and often would see them like siblings, sometimes pretending we were in games. I feel that this is an indicator of how I kind of missed having the company of a young companion, somebody I could communicate at the same level and who would be interested in the things I liked. The reason I feel I should mention this is because it kind of helps paint a picture of life through little Lisa's eyes. Life was often chaotic, unpredictable, stressful, even toxic. Some routes and behaviours children just don't want to see or hear and shouldn't. I believe lifestyle and quality time with our children is one of the many ways that we can build resilience early on with them. Being able to talk through worries without the fear of being judged, ridiculed, or dismissed, it lays the simple foundations for good communication and coping skills later on in life. As an infant in the early 80s, I remember taking my first ability test, still to this day. I can picture the classroom, the uncomfortable wooden chair, the tall stone walls with the displays between the windows. I even remember the distinctive smell, damp smell on that day. The test sheet I was looking at worried me and confused me. I was stuck. Just as I started to understand the question and to start to colour in, I remembered the teacher shouted, "Time's up!" As I looked around, most people had finished, but I still had a whole page to go. So I quickly, randomly shaded in the dots and hoped they were the right choices. The hot and tense sensation as I held back waves of tears is kind of now what I associate with fear. That feeling that was created then. That feeling of fear for little Lisa was traumatic for her, and it set the tone for the rest of her life. I would say this was my first warning that I seem to struggle more so than others in these situations. Also, the point where I would learn to internalize my feelings, to think fast and deal with it. Throughout school, I learnt to mask my struggles and sadness. I would joke things off, despite feeling I had tried to do the right thing and tried my best in various situations I faced. Unfortunately, I always ended up disheartened. Friendships were interesting growing up. I would often seem to go over the top, trying too hard to fit in or belong. This could show by me being overgenerous and being a yes person, going along with the majority and being overprotective of the people I cared for. These were not always the best choices. When I felt comfortable with people, I would often say too much of what's in my head, blurting things out without actually thinking about my words. Other times I would understand wrong or say something out of context with the wrong word for the wrong situation. I vividly remember the overwhelming feeling of regret and embarrassment when my face would show the heat of the internal ball of fire I was trying to contain. As my head silenced all the sounds except for my vibrating heart. Then I'd be left more often than not unable to rectify my mistakes or explain how it's been misunderstood. Most of us can relate to socializing issues growing up. I mean, that's how we subconsciously learn. We often model ourselves on others that we spend time with, listening to guidance and then trying to figure it out, learning and growing from any mistakes we make. Growing up, I would see children enjoying and breezing through school, yet I felt pure stress and pressure from not just the academic work, but also from the expected organization I had to have. On top of the worries of my aloof socializing, as I was now navigating life, seeking my own personality. The teenage years. I felt my teens were tough. My parents' toxic relationship eventually ended when I was 11. Until then, I thought my family experience was the same as everyone else's. I kind of thought what I was going through, everyone else was going through. I remember the day my parents separated. The day they separated, I'd gone to school unaware of how the day would unfold, unaware that it would be another hugely traumatic day that I'd remember in great detail for the rest of my life. In the late 80s, it wasn't common as it is now for parents to separate. Without a doubt, the whole process affected my emotions and coping skills. I struggled with the process of moving out of the family home across town with my mum, as it was away from my dad, friends, and everything I knew. In my defense of my younger self, we didn't have social media back then or mobile phones. So moving across the town in the 80s meant that you hoped to keep in touch through youth groups, if you were lucky, or letters in the post, with the home landlines that were still connected by wires to the walls back then. When I started secondary school, I had to make a great effort to keep old friends. And now I had to make a great effort to make new friends. I was good at talking to people, easily, often oversharing too early. But actually, this somehow helped me to make new friends and to build good relationships in my secondary school circles. I was the quirky, lively, outspoken one, up for a laugh. I loved exercise, and it wasn't hard to get into all the sports teams. But it didn't last, mainly thanks to my lack of organisation or my change of hyperfocus. It didn't take long until I got into a lot of trouble in school. I was always disorganised, late, talking, being cheeky, and disruptive. I was rubbish at lying, so I became overly honest, always explaining what I was doing and why. I often questioned things I didn't agree with or understand. This was all seen as rude by the teachers, but to me, there would be valid reasons for my actions, such as needing more information. I spent most of my lessons working outside the classrooms, actually sat in cupboards, book cupboards, to do my work, missing out on a lot of education from the teachers themselves, because my work was coming from a textbook. And that also included the extra support that I needed in learning, which we now know that I need. A couple of teachers did show empathy with me and encouraged me to keep going, but academically I fell behind and slipped down the ability set classes. Through overthinking, I let the negative self-talk affect my emotions and my self-esteem, which then showed in my behaviour. Each new class meant more new friends building. Again, each time overthinking, then overmasking the anxiety and disappointment. By now, my self-esteem and confidence were pretty damaged, and my sleep was now being affected. I worked super hard, frantically, trying to remember all the social and the school rules. and even the individual teacher rules, because they all had their own rules. In my head, whilst my organisation and timekeeping failed, looking back, school was one big whole traumatic experience. As school wasn't going well, I focused on my social life. I guess I felt more in control of that. It felt easier, or so I thought. I subconsciously widened my circle of friends and mixed more with those who also focused more on socialising. Many were older or struggling in some ways themselves. By the time I got midway through secondary school, I was skipping lessons and had started smoking and drinking. On weekends, I was going out and having parties. Life was all about the social, not about the school. Home life was not great either. My father struggled to get his life back on track after my mum and himself had separated, and my relationship with my mother became really stressful. I often blamed her for my parents' separation and my tough situation. I now understand the reason I was being so awful to her when I was upset was because I felt I could be me with her and it was safe to lose my control in her presence. I was horrid at times, shouting and physically attacking the house. Mum eventually reached out to get help because she was struggling herself as a single parent, a new single parent. And she was also running businesses at the time to keep a roof on our head. One time, I went for a short stay with my nan to allow some space between myself and my mum. And again, another time to stay with my godmother to give us some space. But despite abiding by more rules while staying with them, I was still a handful and a lot to take on. I would return to mum where things would improve for a bit until the next blip would happen, and then we're muddling through the same behaviour patterns again. Grief in our teens. At 14, another traumatic event happened in my life. After a night at the local teenage disco, devastatingly, a dear friend was killed by a car as she walked up the road. Although I wasn't walking with her, unknown to myself and the friends I were walking with, we were walking just yards ahead. We didn't see anything, but we heard the commotion, which stopped us in our tracks as we questioned each other, wondering what was going on and putting it down to other youngsters screaming and making a fuss walking home. We just ruled it out. It was noise of other kids walking home. Although about 10 minutes later into our walk, we were startled by big illuminations of blue flashing lights. They literally lit up the whole sky. Still picture it now as it raced down past us and its piercing sound. It drove through the tunnel towards us and then passed down towards the disco. That piercing ambulance's siren blasted through my ears, my body, literally as it passed through us. Today, the sound and the look of the flashing lights still stop me in my track and take me back to that time. And I pray safety to whoever is going to help. I still go over the conversations we had that night. I remember the discussions on going back. We collectively thought there was a much brighter outcome. Despite that, we knew we probably did know who needed that ambulance. As we were a very young, close community, and the community we felt might need support. It wasn't until the next morning that I found out the true extent of what had happened by telephone, that telephone that's attached to the wall. I heard how it wasn't just somebody I knew of, which would have been bad enough, but a friend that I cared a great deal for. Losing her was a massive shock, not only to me, but also our community and many others, where she was a popular and beautiful member. I struggled greatly trying to understand what had happened. Still do. I found myself being angry at life and even myself for not going back. I kept thinking it would have been my last chance to say goodbye and tell her how special she was. My mind went on overload and my daily struggles increased. I was on edge now, which led to me having a shorter temper. So I was unintentionally falling out with other people I cared for. I lost focus in my life and I began to withdraw. I hated who I'd become. I couldn't control my emotions anymore, and I was seeking ways to escape that feeling. I ended up in hospital and was assigned a psychiatrist. After a total breakdown, I was diagnosed with my first diagnosis, depression. First of many. Now, the serendipity in this and the importance of this story, not only that it means so much, is that after talking through some of my struggles with my psychiatrist of struggling in school, struggling socially, struggling academically, and struggling with this recent grief and my parents' separation, I actually found out she was the godmother of the friend that I had recently lost. And we shared a very special moment. And I was also reminded, not just that this time, but many others in life, how precious life actually is. I was advised that I should take some time off school, which, in all my honesty, was a huge relief. I was now doing my education at home on my bed. Effectively full-time homework with no teacher or social input. I had no inspiration to learn. I kept basically facing failure after failure. I was isolated and bored. And also, with it being the mid-90s, there was no social media and there was no dozens of TV programs. I think we still had 4 then. So I couldn't procrastinate with much, to be fair. Exams came around and my grades did not match the expected grades. Things had slid dramatically. So I move on to adolescence. Thanks to a few teachers still having some belief in me and a chat with a careers advisor, I started to work on a placement in a travel agent, which I loved. I had a new hyperfocus and I was really good at it. Winning awards and holidays. It's all goal focused. Life seemed to be going okay now. I was happy, making money in a career I enjoyed. The icing on the cake would be falling in love. I was quite mature for my age in many ways, so it seemed natural the next step after leaving school and getting a job was to settle down. I was 18. And I also thought, now, buy a first home. So it wasn't long before we were married with another child, 2 children. Although still young, everything felt perfect. I loved being a mummy and wife. I always had a natural skill with children and dreamed of a happy family of my own. Being a mummy filled me with joy and love, including a focus and a purpose in life, which I had lost earlier in my teens. As my children started nursery, I had a void and began to miss my career. However, as I wanted to stay with my children while they were so young, I decided to work from home, running my own teletext holiday business. Computers have become more common by now. We're talking the noughties. And as industries started to create home working options, such as BT being one of the pioneers and teletext holidays, which took me into my adult life, adulting. Life was good. So we moved from our starter home to a new, bigger family home, a 60s renovation project. Probably a slightly hasty move, as this was when the marriage started to begin to suffer. My husband worked long hours and enjoyed socializing to relax. I adored my children. They brought me so much happiness and kept me going. But the increased pressure made me feel isolated from my partner, as we were spending less time together and less time communicating. We were so young and navigating through our own egos through life, not respecting each other's emotions or communicating with each other properly. At this time, support still seemed like a weakness and not really explored unless you reached a crisis point. I felt completely alone in my struggles, keeping everything in allowing old experiences to cloud my thoughts. At the times we did open up communication, it was more of an emotional explosion. I felt insecure and scared, as my marriage showed similar toxic patterns to those of my parents' relationship. I began to reflect on the past, the anger, the sorrow, everything I saw as a child, and how I desperately wanted my children to experience a different family life than my own. I knew we couldn't continue the way we were, so I left in a moment of hyperfocus. In hindsight, not the best thing to do. I had another relationship with all the changes in the routines and the shake-up in security. I wasn't healed from the trauma of my previous relationship and separation, if I'm honest. And I was already feeling a complete failure to myself, full of guilt, as I was unable to do the one thing that I promised myself I'd never do. Let my children come from a broken home. Or miss out on a nuclear family life, as I did. Addiction. It can take a year for a neurodivergent person to adapt to change. Not that I knew this back in my 20s. Like my mother and my grandmother, I was a single parent. Many times I contemplated my decision on leaving my husband, as things were not as easy as I expected. I worked hard and tried to keep it together as best I could for my children. I silenced the thoughts and feelings, masking my emotions, but just kept reliving old experiences and listening to negative self-talk in my head. Then I suddenly found a new way to deal with my emotions: alcohol. It helped raise my vibration and hide the sad feelings, making life seem easier. The drinking increased. However, the problems came back in the morning. So I began drinking earlier in the day. I'd created a coping method, using alcohol as a safety net rather than facing the realities of life. Within 2 years, I abused my body, with alcohol to the ultimate extreme, where my body now relied on alcohol. I couldn't go an hour without a drink. Without drinking for too long, I would not be able to physically function. And I don't just mean your day-to-day brain. I mean your body, the shakes, and the actual excruciating pain that you feel in your joints when you can't stand up, not being able to walk. My increased use of alcohol had triggered a hereditary addictive gene, which had shown addictions in various family members, in forms of addiction, food, exercise, and gaming, to name a few. When I recognized I had a problem, the failed bouts of cold turkey and the limited counselling options that didn't work anyway, unknown to me at the time, my immune system was weak. My body couldn't cope with the extreme amounts of alcohol I was consuming to function. My body gave up, setting me up for my next traumatic experience, my next big challenge: overcoming a near-death experience. Despite having little memory of my drinking days, I can remember the last day I drank. The smell of grapefruit juice often triggers my senses and my memory, as my children had just served me my breakfast on Mother's Day in the early noughties when I collapsed on the floor. I came around, lying on the floor, hearing my children screaming, "Mummy! Mummy! Mummy!" I used every piece of strength I had in my body to pull myself off the floor and onto the sofa to pretend I was okay, and calmly asked them to pass me the phone and get an adult. Within minutes, I had gone from talking to a doctor on the phone to him at the house, to a 999 call, to an ambulance dash into intensive care where I would stay for the next month. As doctors were not used to seeing someone so young with such extreme alcohol damage, it took a while to ascertain the reason I was failing. Eventually, they found out I was suffering from pancreatitis, brought on by excessive drinking. My pancreas had become damaged for some time, and parts had broken off, causing blockages to my vital organs. I had liver disease, a pseudocyst, and didn't even weigh 6 stone. I'm told it was a pretty scary time for my family and friends, as they all believed they were saying goodbye to me. Lying in the hospital bed, I was surrounded with an array of machinery and fluids to keep me alive. I had feeding tubes in my neck to feed me, drains from my liver and my urethra. And I have unnerving flashbacks and memories of my time in hospital, which actually seems like a psychedelic dream. If I'm honest, drifting between consciousness and the pain relief. I can recall some of those awake times when the visitors were there, but the most haunting memories that I have are those when I was under sedation. A recurring dream throughout my stay that sounded similar to an out-of-body experience, where you feel like you're watching life from a TV screen and you keep returning to the same part as if there's a lesson or a clue to learn in the dream. I guess your mind is working, but your body isn't. And it made it all feel so very real, and it filled me with fear at the time, not knowing if I was there, present, or if anyone could hear me. Do you remember I mentioned my psychiatrist during my breakdown in hospital at 14? And how she was the godmother of my dear departed friend. And I felt it was a message to me to appreciate life back then. Well, one night in hospital, whilst healing, on the mend, and waking from sleepy sedation, I remember not feeling alone, but hearing a muffled talk in a kind tone. In the darkness, I made out a nurse figure. However, the more I listened, I recognised the voice. And she seemed to know me more than a patient in the way that she spoke. It wasn't until I left hospital that I realised who that nurse was. The nurse that had been popping by, keeping me company in the dark hours in hospital, was actually one of the bestest friends of our dearly departed friend, who we lost at the age of 14. I felt it was another incredible coincidence, or even spiritual sign. A reminder that I can overcome the current challenges. I had been reminded again by our dear friend that it was time, when I was carelessly risking my own life again, to take things into my own hands and to start facing these dark times and becoming the warrior I am. Hospital fixed me. Now, finally detoxed and sober, although that wasn't even half the battle of recovery. I had to then actually face life sober, feel my emotions and heal. I was overwhelmed with guilt and the shame of letting down those that had tried to help me. And of course, my own children, who I love so dearly and had been trying to protect. My babies, who I cared for so much. I must have been wondering where on earth mummy was. Recovery. I was told to take bed rest, but I felt I had no time to waste. With a bout of hyperfocus, and the second my body let me move, I started planning and rebuilding my life. Now, to me, this meant changing routines, social circles, and career, so I could start again, like a new chapter in the book. Our family life improved, and I decided a career in education made perfect sense. As I love my children and got on great with others, I felt inspired to help children struggling like I did. And I found out early on I was quite good at it. So I invested in getting to a point in my career where I could actually make a difference. Education as an adult. I returned to education in my late 20s to pass my GCSEs, which I had failed at school, convincing myself it would be different this time because I wanted to become a teacher. That was something I was passionate about, and I made that choice to learn. So it was much different this time. I couldn't get enough. I was learning like a sponge and began to progress to university. At the beginning of my adult education journey, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. I found this actually incredibly hard to process because at the time I was actually an aspiring teacher who was working with children with additional learning needs. Now, I had an additional learning need. I questioned actually at the time if I could even do the job. And because of this, self-sabotage began. I was questioning my abilities. I also realised I felt grief for my younger self, wishing I could go back and tell her, "You're not the class clown. You do have a brain. Just thinks differently. Learn what you like to shine." If I knew then my brain was wired differently, I would have made very different choices, and I would have been much easier on myself, and maybe not even suffer from the previous traumatic events. After some professional support, I started to understand my diagnosis and how many self-coping skills I had already taught myself over the years. And they helped me to look at the positives in my diagnosis, and my concerns eased. Adulting again. My children were thriving and settled into their routines at school, and I was at work. We were happy and secure in our family home. Then a new romance bloomed with someone I met through work. Looking back, I could see the red flags, with the potential to cause problems later on. But I was lost in the excitement of the new relationship and the attention and affection of being an adult again. I found I had a bit more me time than my preteen, as my preteens were spending more time with their friends. And my partner liked his social life, so I actually had quite a lot of spare time. My career was settled and going well, so I thought it would be a good idea to start a network marketing business as a hobby, really. It didn't take long for this to be my next hyper-focus, as it gave me a social life, glamour, and all the positive guidance I was seeking. The support and self-development in the business was like food for my soul. I learnt ways to create structure whilst building my confidence and practicing positive self-talk. I had found another passion that I thought sat perfectly in my life. Enjoying good money, gifts, and worldwide holidays, whilst experiencing talks and trainings from leading worldwide motivational speakers. Life appeared great. So the timing seemed right to set up a new family home with my partner. We bought a cottage to renovate. And it wasn't too long until I found out I was expecting with child too. The pregnancy was tough. I was ill. I had gastro-diabetes, thanks to my previous illnesses, and I withdrew from socialising unless it served a purpose, such as for work, and began to struggle internally, focusing on trying to be a good mum and supporting my dad, who now was showing worrying signs after a couple of strokes in the last couple of years. I decided not to go back to my employment in education, and I focused on my business as it showed more flexibility and potential at the time. I was an only child, Dad was single, and had been ever since Mum left him. I therefore had a tough job of convincing Dad to see the doctor. He was diagnosed with vascular dementia. It seemed his social and unhealthy lifestyle had taken a toll on him. I remember looking up the diagnosis on my phone thinking it must be wrong because it said he could die. Surely you can't die from losing your memory. At that point, I never thought he would. I honestly had no idea what to expect and wasn't taking in anything I was being told or reading, as I thought he was going to be fixed. As I approached my 40s, a couple of years after Dad's diagnosis, my world crashed. Dad had a quick period of deterioration and passed before I even had a chance to acknowledge what was going on. There hadn't been any support from the applications that we had put in place. Mind you, Dad was great at fooling people regarding his illness. When needed, right up until his last days. I believe so much more awareness is needed on Alzheimer's, as I had no idea what to expect or how to support him. I was Daddy's little girl. He always had the playful role and let Mum do the reprimand. I will never forget how he stood by me through my struggles with alcohol, literally picking me up from pools of blood. Dad owned a big piece of my heart, which was now empty. For a while, I managed to mask my grief, even to myself, internalizing my emotions, which were now taking a toll on my body. I was gaining weight fast, despite eating healthy and taking daily exercise. My business suffered as I couldn't focus. I lost interest and lacked motivation. I was struggling, and it was showing in my emotions and abilities. It was then I opened up to a friend about my health and emotional struggles, and she suggested I looked into menopause. Well, after a positive test and a succession of appointments, it was confirmed I was in the thick of menopause. I remember feeling a short-lived, huge sense of relief, hoping HRT would fix all my problems. And it did help many of my symptoms. However, grief soon follows. Grieving over not being able to have any more children when I had always hoped for one more. Then fear as I realized I was growing older and that my life was far from safe and secure. By now, I had learned a new focus. This would help me through tough times. So I jumped into my master's, and went back to academia, studying psychology, and got a job. I was now employed working with children again, which gave me the needed focus and structure and routine I needed for a while. Looking back, I wasn't ready to go back to work. Despite my desire to be successful and my eagerness, at this time everything seemed so much harder. I assumed I was still processing the trauma of losing Dad, with so many unanswered questions and feeling of guilt. I sought to get help from my university for CBT to help heal. Instead, I ended up with a psychiatrist with referrals for ADHD and autism to go along with the dyslexia. Another failed family. Despite still facing setback after setback and my now increasingly difficult toxic relationship with my partner, I convinced myself my life was back on track to happier times. If we fix my brain, then it will fix the whole family, I thought, taking all the blame for all the issues at home. Then another setback came, which shook my world when I found my partner to be dishonest. The pain of previous traumas and all the issues begin to flood back in like a big tsunami, as did all the fears of other failed relationships, which then paralyzed my thoughts as I couldn't bear thinking about the reality and try to block it all out. It wasn't too hard. Before I'd actually had the chance to heal these wounds, within weeks, my partner's father became ill and sadly passed. I stood by him and supported him as I felt it was the right thing to do, despite it also reminding me painfully of the loss of my own father just a couple of years before. We struggled on for a while, but trust was broken, and harder times became harder. We half-heartedly tried counselling, but had become two different people, spending too much time apart, never really solving any problems, just continuously triggering each other. Although my ability to work was still there, I struggled with focus and organisation in handling any of my work pressures. I was making silly mistakes as my anxiety was on overload. I was feeling a failure as my family toxic patterns in a relationship seemed visible again now. I couldn't help feeling alone in my struggles as old experiences clouded my thoughts. Then when I did open up, again, it was the emotional outburst rather than communicating all the things that was going on in my head. Unfortunately, after 13 years, our relationship ended when he told me one day he was leaving. There, just like that. This leads me on to the present and the current traumatic experience I'm overcoming now, where I have faced a barrage of attacks on my finances, my career, and my biggest love of all, my children. This time has been really hard, as my head began thinking, is this too one many blows? Too many adverse experiences, as we now refer to them? My body and brain didn't feel connected. I didn't believe I was worthy of happiness, even questioning if I could recover this time. I recognized these feelings, though. They were grief. So I tried to focus on healing and planning. After the shock passed and the tears slowed, I realized this time is different. I wasn't prepared this time. I had no plans. I needed a different approach. different coping methods. Quickly, I had to dig down in my brain and find my inner warrior. I needed to protect my 3 children who had already suffered so much at my expense. Which brings us to the present day. I moved us back to safety. The safety and security of my hometown which had been for 3 decades previously, the other side of town. The challenge of homelessness and living in a caravan with a change of job and new friendships to start all over has been a roller coaster of emotions, I can tell you. But we got over it. We lived that chapter. And I might write that one for you one day soon. So as I sit here today with you, I am truly grateful to you all for the support of the family and friends that I've had over the years, from childhood through to adult now. I don't know how this story would read without you all. I have to mention how incredible my mother has been in supporting us all. Now she does the roles of both her and my father these days. I'm proud to say we are the healthiest and happiest we have ever been. And although we are far from the end of our struggles, we are excited about the future, and it may not be plain sailing. And I no doubt know we will face more struggles, but I'm okay with that. Recent dramas and changes have built our resilience and added to our ever-growing toolbox to take on most struggles. And I love sharing them with others who are struggling too. The powerful part of healing over the last couple of years is that I have become the person I was on track to be before decades of failures, criticism, and misguidance took me on the wrong path. Being able to learn about my brain has been one of the most enlightening moments in this recovery. Receiving the correct diagnosis, guidance, and support for my neurodiversities has been pleasantly overwhelming over the years of misdiagnosis and depression and anxiety, the various pill poppings I was giving that made no difference at all. Finally, I can support all my obvious signs of neurodiversity, which have been shown through all of my life in the likes of addiction, erratic behavior, breakdowns, and emotions. Everything makes sense now. My brain is wired differently, which is why I face the struggles that others may not understand and why my reactions may be different to others. I am able to be kinder to myself and begin to love myself, knowing that I'm not a bad person who intentionally does anything wrong. We are now understanding the reach of neurodiversity in not just ours, but the wider family. And generally healing 3 generations of trauma within our own family, dating back to my incredible grandmother in World War II. And my irreplaceable mother, who I spoke of before, throughout my own beautiful babies. We are gaining new levels of respect between us and supporting each other in understanding our emotions. I hope this will reset the subconscious low boundaries in relationships that females in our family have set previously, enabling us all to have happier, healthier relationships here on in. Thank you for listening to me. It's Lisa Kelly and Triumph in the Face of Adversity.